Thank you very much, Will, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming at this late stage of the conference when everybody wants to take a nap. I appreciate it. Thank you to the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for hosting this Congress, and a special thank you to Rosie and Mark. Special thanks are also due to my organization, the Association Culturelle des Tamouls en France, and its fraternal organizations within the UN Economic and Social Council. The Tamil Movement Association in Switzerland, who provided my funding to be here, and to the group of Tamil lawyers and academics in the United Kingdom who authored the briefing document that I've made available. Each provided a measure of the support that was necessary for me to be here. So I have a little bit of extended time, given that my co-panelist was sick today, and I'll just briefly describe a little bit of the work that I do as a lobbyist at the UN Human Rights Council. My NGO forms part of a network of 8 Tamil-focused NGOs who present at the UN Human Rights Council on a regular basis, as well as such sessions as the Universal Periodic Review. Since 2009, which I'll be explaining why that date is significant, we've, as a World Tamil Movement, been lobbying for recognition of the genocide that took place against the Tamil people. We have also been trying to raise awareness about smaller scale but no less heinous human rights abuses that take place on a regular basis in Sri Lanka. While the Sinhalese population has also been targeted during some of these human rights abuses, the vast majority of victims are Tamil. We, as expatriates who are in the diaspora, who do not live in Sri Lanka and therefore are not bound by its government, have the freedom of speech to advocate in ways that our brothers and sisters on the ground in Sri Lanka do not. We amplify their voices, particularly in this period, the families of the victims of the disappeared, who disappeared during and after the Civil War. And that is the impetus behind what I am doing as an individual. So having said all of that, I will get into a little bit of the history of the conflict in Sri Lanka, and following that history, I'll speak on the topic of the Genocide Convention and how it applies. My topic today is a contentious one, although it should not be. I am speaking about genocide against the Tamil people, and I would argue the Tamil nation that resides on the island of Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan state persecution of the Elam Tamil nation has produced a sizable diaspora to which I belong. So first of all, I will speak about the history of the conflict between the Sri Lankan state and the Tamil people, who eventually constituted themselves as a national group. I will then speak to an incomplete degree about the legalities of the genocide claim. I say incomplete because much work remains to be done before this claim will be advanced in any of the appropriate legal fora, given the depth and the gravity that the charge demands. This Congress, perhaps, comprises part of that preliminary work. So, to begin, the island known today as Sri Lanka was inhabited by several people groups before colonization. The Sinhalese, who trace their origins to the Bengal region of northwestern India, have lived there for at least 2,500 years. Tamouls, a Dravidian group that spans several present-day countries in Southeast Asia, have also lived on the island for at least that long. Both groups have a lengthy recorded history. It bears noting that there is an indigenous grouping on the island that apparently predates both the Tamils and the Sinhalese, called the Vedas. Again, prior to colonization, Muslim traders settled in the eastern region of the island, and while these so-called Moors retained a distinct identity based on their religion, they adopted Tamil as their language. Dutch and Portuguese colonizers introduced 2 new groups: the Burghers, a mixed-race group primarily descended from European colonist men and Sinhalese women, and the upcountry Tamils, who the British brought from South India to work as indentured laborers on tea plantations. A small African-descended group also lives on the island since Portuguese colonization. Prior to British colonization, the island's people separated themselves according to kingdoms and principalities, the Tamils occupying the northeast, and the Sinhalese the southwest regions of the island. As the demographic reality became more complex and difficult to manage colonially, the British amalgamated all the various power bases of the island into a single centralized unit of colonial administration that they named the Island of Ceylon. As the traditionally Tamil north and east of the island are not fertile agricultural land, Tamil families placed a high premium on education for civil service in British missionary schools as a means of economic advancement. Consequently, the British relied on the Tamil minority to become colonial clerks and used their allocation of status to keep Sinhalese resentments in check. The British Empire collapsed after 1945. Economically restrained by the aftermath of World War II, the British government decided to focus on investing in its own infrastructure and social well-being, rather than in administering half of the world. Having left India in 1947 and partitioning it, having left Palestine to both the Jews and the Palestinians in separate agreements about the same territory, the British also ensured that the legacy they left in Ceylon was one of ethnic division. Immediately after independence, Sinhalese politicians, representing some 75% of the population, took advantage of their numerical superiority to control government. In exchange for the security of their own political positions, Tamil power brokers agreed to strip the restive and militantly leftist upcountry Tamil population of their votes. This left 1 million Tamils stateless, and the broader Tamil polity even weaker. The movement of political Buddhism had begun as a reaction to colonialism, but after independence, it developed into a Sinhala Buddhist supremacist movement. It held great sway in politics, which continues to this day. Seizing upon the position of strength that resulted from disenfranchising the upcountry Tamils, successive governments enacted legislation intended to entrench Sinhalese Buddhist privilege into the constitutional structure. In 1956, the Sinhala-only Act was passed in deference to militant Buddhist monks. Buddhism was declared the state religion, and Sinhala the sole official language. 1956 and 1958 saw anti-Tamil pogroms over land. By 1961, the situation of Tamils had become so dire as to provoke a campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience, led primarily by the upcountry Tamil trade union movement, but drawing in much of the rest of the Tamil population as well. In 1971, the Sri Lankan government attempted to address overrepresentation of the Tamil population in white-collar professions, a result of Tamil agricultural realities, by instituting a quota system, in which Tamil students had to score higher than Sinhalese students in order to pass their entrance exams. The result was a dramatically lower Tamil student population, a much higher Tamil youth unemployment rate, and thus a movement of highly politicized Tamil youth who had access neither to education nor to work. They saw that they would never have influenced parliamentary proceedings, and they had witnessed a failed nonviolent movement. The result, in hindsight, was predictable. While on one hand, the Ceylonese government renamed itself Sri Lanka, adopted a constitution that explicitly granted Buddhism the foremost place within the country, on the other hand, many of these disaffected youth began to study politics and to form small armed groups. Absent a political voice, they called for an independent state of Tamil. Their calls fell on fertile ground. By 1976, 5 years after the standardization of university entrance exams, their pressure was strong enough to influence all existing Tamil parties to reject the Sri Lankan state, to form a single political party called the Tamil United Liberation Front, which then adopted a common declaration known as the Vattukodai Resolution, binding its signatories to the establishment of an independent, sovereign, secular, socialist state of Tamilam. This manifesto stated, and I quote, "There is only one alternative, and that is to proclaim with a stamp of finality and fortitude that we alone shall rule over our land that our forefathers ruled. Sinhalese imperialism shall quit our homeland." End quote. The Tamil United Liberation Front regards the general election of 1977 as a means of proclaiming to the Sinhalese government this resolve of the Tamil nation. And every vote that you cast for the front will go to show that the Tamil nation is determined to liberate itself from Sinhalese domination. So this was the manifesto of the Tamil United Liberation Front in the 1977 general election. That election was won resoundingly in the Tamil North and East by the TULF. Its members were prevented from taking their seats because they refused to swear a loyalty oath to the Sri Lankan state. The representatives were forced to flee to India, actually to Tamil Nadu. A new round of anti-Tamil pogroms took place after the election result as retaliation for this vote. So, failing both nonviolent and parliamentary options, the only option remaining lay in the hands of armed groups. In 1983, one of those groups, the Liberation Tigers of Tamilam, or LTTE, skirmished with a small group of soldiers, leaving 13 dead. Within hours, voters' lists that identified homes and businesses as belonging to Tamouls ended up in the hands of mobs of violent Sinhalese men. The targets were Tamouls who had had nothing to do with the armed groups. Across the island, 3,000 Tamouls were killed for nothing more than their ethnicity within a space of days. A vast wave of refugees, including my own relatives and the families of nearly all of my Tamil acquaintances, left Sri Lanka to save their lives. Meanwhile, in an interview with the London Daily Telegraph on July 11, 1983, President Jayawardena of Sri Lanka stated, quote, "I am not worried about the opinion of the Jaffna, i.e. the Tamil people now. Now we cannot think about them, not about their lives or of their opinion about us. The more you put pressure in the Tamil North, the happier the Sinhala people will be here. Really, if I starve the Tamils out, the Sinhala people will be happy." End quote. Between 1983 and 2009, the government and the LTTE fought a brutal conflict that left 100,000 confirmed dead. Most of these were Tamils. The United Nations estimated that 40,000 were killed during the final 2 months of the war. According to the Tamil Catholic clergy, another 146,679 are recorded to have gone missing. In this brief history, I have focused primarily on the history that preceded the armed conflict. This is because my aim is to demonstrate that genocidal tendencies and intent existed at a time when the Tamil people pursued their aims using nonviolent and democratic means. Small-scale violence from Tamil armed groups, such as the attack on the army convoy in 1983, became the pretext for heavy state-sponsored violence. Tamils were forced into a logic of conflict violence, during which the borders of a proto-state of Tamililam were created, not through democratic means, in accordance with the right to self-determination under the UN Charter, but through the force of arms. So, having completed the history, I will now turn to an application of the Convention on Genocide to the relationship between the Tamils and the Sri Lankan state. Ceylon, later to become Sri Lanka, was one of the first signatories to the Genocide Convention. Article 2 of the Convention reads, "In the present Convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, as such: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and finally, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group." Let's look at each in turn. Killing members of the group. It might be clear that members of the Tamil nation were killed for nothing more than being Tamil, particularly during the riots of July 1983 and in such conflict-related attacks. The fact that voters' lists with names classified by ethnicity appeared in the hands of rioters who then killed Tamils without police or army intervention should indicate possible collusion of the state. But President Jayawardena's interview from July 1983 strongly indicates a possible genocidal intent. I recall the quote, "Now we cannot think about them, not about their lives." Similarly, bombing raids that targeted, for instance, the Central Orphanage in 2006 killed non-combatant Tamils, in this case, orphan schoolgirls. The Tamil National Alliance, elected Tamil representatives at the time, used this language in a press release. "The attack is not merely atrocious and inhuman, it has clearly a genocidal intent. The heavy aerial bombardment on the premises clearly indicates that the attack was premeditated, deliberate, and vicious." The representatives then appealed to the international community to, quote, "take the earliest possible action to stop the Sri Lankan state from proceeding with its genocidal program." Keep in mind this was 2006. By 2009, a Channel 4 BBC documentary called No Fire Zone shows that in the final days of the conflict, the army told non-combatants to gather in specific areas to keep themselves safe. The Sri Lankan army then shelled those exact areas, resulting in, as I've stated, at least 40,000 dead within the space of weeks. The UN Secretary General later apologized for his organization's inaction during this time. Killing non-combatant members of the Tamil people group, whether during army operations or by vigilantes, was commonplace during the conflict. 100,000 Tamils are independently confirmed dead. Now, just a few days ago, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia declared the systematic massacre of 8,000 Bosnian Muslim males in July 1995 by Bosnian Serbs to have constituted a genocide, for which Serbia itself held responsibility by not punishing the killers. Now, this is 8,000. Even counting the figures of the final days of the war, we're talking about 40,000. Tamouls, for some reason, are being told not to call for a genocide charge. So I'll leave you to do the math on why that might be. Next on the convention's list, causing serious mental or bodily harm to members of the group. The briefing document that I provided details several post-conflict cases of sexual violence against Tamil men and women inflicted on detainees often held without charge, and frequently on Tamil women simply going about their daily lives. These stories are from between 2009 and 2014. It was an effect of the military power of the LTTE that Sri Lankan soldiers did not often use sexual violence against Tamil women during the conflict. The LTTE itself strictly banned sexual violence within the territory that it controlled, as well as unquestionably forbidding its troops to use this as a weapon of war. After the conflict, however, with the LTTE decimated, an epidemic of sexual violence perpetrated by Sri Lankan security forces has plagued the Tamil population. On November 8th, earlier this very month, 50 Tamil refugees in Europe reported that sexual violence had been used against them while in custody to extract confessions to crimes that they had not committed. All these survivors are Tamil men. Sexual violence causes both mental and bodily harm. Next on the list of the Genocide Convention, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. To this day, thousands of Tamil families remain displaced from their land. At the end of the conflict, the Sri Lankan government placed several 100,000 Tamils in internment camps, citing security grounds. 300,000 were held in the infamous Manik Farm camp alone. Not many have had their land returned to them. Instead, Sri Lankan army settlements, populated by Sinhalese soldiers, have sprung up on their properties. Some of these families have been demonstrating for nearly a year now for the return of their land. Some has been returned, most land has not. Without access to land, these impoverished Tamil families have no means of making their livings via fishing, nor farming, nor can they properly educate their children. Often, they cannot even secure adequate housing. There is no way for them to make a living. Land grabbing is a deliberate policy that arguably intentionally dilutes the traditionally Tamil character of the northeast region of the island and destroys the ability of Tamil families to provide for themselves, thus contributing to the physical destruction of the group. Similarly, in 2015, the Sri Lankan newspaper Ceylon Today reported the remarks of TNA MP Sritharan, who said that the increase in the peddling of drugs to use in the Tamil North was part of a genocidal agenda. Tamil civil society representatives, states the Tamil Guardian, condemned the impunity with which drug dealers were allowed to work in the area, blaming the police for deliberate inaction and aiding the criminals. Another report from the Tamil Guardian that same year stated that beer consumption increased to over 4 million liters from the initial consumption levels of 762,610 liters in 2009. The president of the Jaffna Chamber of Commerce added that the liquor stores had been illegally set up near temples, schools, and important institutions. Again, it appears that as a matter of unstated policy, Tamil areas are being flooded with alcohol and narcotics, which is a form of self-medication in cases of psychological distress. These often have the effect of physically harming the user. Fourth on the list of conditions that can constitute genocide, imposing measures to prevent births in the group. In 2013, the Sri Lankan journal Ground Views reported that coercive methods were used to convince Tamil women to accept long-lasting birth control implants. These included threats to deny further medical services and manipulation of access to medical information regarding the implants. This is documented in the briefing documents provided to you and elsewhere. Fifth, and finally, the Genocide Convention lists forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Here it must be said, direct population transfer has not taken place, to my knowledge. However, in January 2013, it was recorded that Sinhalese soldiers were reporting to schools in full uniform and claiming authority to teach Tamil children. Now in Tamil areas, Tamil is spoken first and English second. These soldier teachers taught in Sinhalese. The unstated intent seems to have been to destroy the cultural identity of these school children. So, in each of the 5 possible manifestations of genocide that the convention lists, there is at least one case, but often innumerable cases, where investigation into a possibly genocidal act is both justified and desirable. Now, while several European and North American countries have applauded the Sirisena government, elected in 2015, for its change in tone from that of the previous administration, it is important to point out that many of these potential violations have occurred under its watch as well. Yet, Sirisena insists on upholding the culture of impunity on the island. The day after the 50 men reported the use of sexual violence in Sri Lankan custody, the president spoke to army officers about his intent to shield them from war tribunals. This is also documented in a number of different news outlets. The long-standing and continual attacks on the Tamil people have given them an awareness of themselves as a nation. The Tamil nation, many of us believe, is one that has experienced a genocide, and in the first steps toward healing, the likelihood that such a genocide has occurred must be acknowledged. Those accused of responsibility for committing such acts must be tried according to international law. Whether the facts support the allegations or not is a matter for an impartial, international tribunal to decide. This process of instituting justice and ending impunity must take place before the healing of the nations can begin. So, thank you very much. I will open the floor to questions. There is a historical relationship that goes back at least several decades. I'll be brief about it, but the short answer is yes and no. So I don't believe, for example, that Sri Lanka and India necessarily collude to impose measures on their respective Tamil populations. The evidence doesn't seem to support that. However, given the history of India post-British independence and given the history of Sri Lanka post-independence, in which the Tamil people were oppressed in both states, there has been a historical affinity of mutual respect and support. So, for example, the famous film director MGR was a strong supporter of the Elam Tamil movement. Himself came from the Indian-descended Tamil population in Sri Lanka and made his film career in Chennai. So that's just one example. At this very moment, my NGO works alongside the May 17 movement in Chennai as well. Last Human Rights Council session, we welcomed a representative of the organization, and the May 17 movement supports the Elam Tamil cause, but is very strongly dedicated to preserving the Tamil identity within Tamil Nadu. So that's a brief answer to the question. Is that good enough? Yeah. All right.
Do we have any other questions? There's no other questions. We're good right there. Thank you very much.